So, today on this channel, we are going to look at warning signs that someone may become an active shooter or an active bomber. I encourage you to stay because this is important stuff that you probably won't hear anywhere else. So, let's get into this. The Doctor of Disaster is a wholly owned subsidiary of Warnick and Associates Incorporated. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Doctor of Disaster. I am the Doctor of Disaster, Dr. Mark Warnick, PhD, of course. I am considered a subject matter expert by not one, but two different universities in public health, emergency management, and public safety. Before I start, I'd like to remind you to like, subscribe, and comment. So let's get into this. Over the years, I've done a lot of research, and I've been researching off and on since early 2000s about how to prevent active shooters, active bombers, and preventing mass violence. In fact, I'm under contract with Wiley Books to put out a new book on how to prevent mass shootings. So, what I've done is I've researched what was the highest propensity of actions that were seen in mass shooters between the years of 2000 and 2020. Now, this research is extensive, but as you work it on out, you will see that these help show you what to look for. And then you can notify police, the FBI, or some other organization. And if they are on the job, it may prevent a mass shooting. Now, this is not always 100% correct. You have to use some common sense along with this. To start with, we need to realize that most of the mass shooters or the mass shootings that have happened, they are committed by males, men, young men at that. Typical age of them is less than 20. Why? Well, they have come to the conclusion that reasoning in the human brain doesn't develop as quickly as the rest of it. So a person may be 20 or 25 before all of their reasoning comes to play in their psyche. Now, this doesn't mean that there can't be active shooters that are 30, 40, 50 or more, because there has been. But young males tend to have a higher propensity. Less than 20 were most common. 20 to 30 were the second most common, and 30 to 40 were the third most common. 40 and above is a rare instance. We also need to look at race. The vast majority of those that commit active shootings and active bombings are Caucasian. We don't know why. Perhaps they feel because they are Caucasian that something should be different in their life. I also want to go back to the gender. And while we say males are most prevalent, it does not mean that females cannot be a mass shooter, because they can. And there have been instances, but they're very, very rare. So let's look at the mental emotional indicators that someone might become a mass shooter. Has the person threatened homicide or suicide? If they have, This is one of the key indicators that was found in this research. Additionally, we found out that if they post on social media with threats or they have an extremely dark psyche, they might become a mass shooter or bomber. If there's pet or animal torture, there's a high propensity that they could become a mass shooter. Now, none of these are guaranteed. It's just these early warning signs were seen in a lot of those that committed mass shootings. Another thing is pet or animal torture. Now, this is different than animal abuse. This is actually torturing them. And those that tortured animals had a high propensity to become a mass shooter or bomber. Have they discussed with multiple people about becoming a mass shooter or bomber? If they have, then there is a high propensity that they may become one. And that includes fantasizing about it. Do they have an abnormal interest in guns or bombs? It's important to realize I'm not talking about the guy that has two, three, four, five guns and they occasionally buy one to exercise their Second Amendment right or to go hunting or target practice. What I'm talking about is the person that hasn't had a gun ever in their life, and all of a sudden they're going out and buying a gun and a lot of ammunition or several firearms and quite a lot of ammunition. This is a sign that they may be in line for becoming an active shooter. Have they had fantasies of homicide or suicide that they've discussed, or, you know, not even discussed, but you understand that they're in that spot in their life and in their mentality that they could possibly kill someone else or themselves? Now, there's also pet or animal abuse. And this is different from the torture in that instead of literally torturing the animal, they abuse it. They may kick it, they may slap it, they may beat on it. They've just lost their temper. This is another sign. And have they impulse purchased weapons? And when I say weapons, I don't mean one, I mean multiple. So all of these signs were high value factors that were seen in the background of past mass shooters. When I say high value, these showed up more than 60% of the time in mass shooters and the mass bombers. What about the moderate value factors? These are things that showed up 30 to 60% of the time in past shooters and bombers. Did they discuss becoming an active shooter or an active bomber to one person? Just one. Did they have an abnormal fascination with weapons that had high capacity magazines? So if they're looking at a pistol with 6 rounds versus a pistol that could hold a 25 round capacity, interest in high capacity is a model for potentially becoming one. Is there a confirmed history of child abuse in their background? Now, this is not to say that everyone that wants a high capacity magazine or that has child abuse in their background will become a mass shooter. But a large portion of those that became shooters had that type of background. Have they played or do they play active shooter games in video? Now, this is controversial. This really is. They say that there's no correlation And once again, we need to remember correlation doesn't mean causation. But they say there's no correlation between active shooter video games and active shooters, but somewhere between 30 and 60% of those that became shooters had this in their background. Do they have abnormal interest or fascination with violent scenes in movies? If so, that may be another sign. Do they have no negative contact with law enforcement? Are officers having to see them more than once or twice? And are they always in trouble and the law is trying to figure out what they're going to do next? That's another sign. Have they had a confrontational contact at school, church, or work? That again is another sign. Do they have angry social media? Angry social media is something that we've seen that there's a propensity for, a moderate propensity, in these individuals that become mass shooters and bombers. Are they on social media portraying guns? Once again, these are signs, moderate signs, that showed up 30 to 60% of the time. Now, what about low value factors? These are things that showed up occasionally, less than 30% of the time. Do they have current drug or alcohol issues? Do they have an abnormal interest in other weapons other than guns or bombs? In their background, is there a history of child neglect? Do they suffer depression? Can you describe them as paranoid? Do they have emotional outbursts? Believe it or not, this was somewhat more prevalent, and we saw that there was correlation there. Do they have a history of violence against others? Have they been in a lot of fights? Are they a domestic abuser? These are more signs. Do they have aggressive or explosive behavior? How about if they take abnormal chances so they can get an adrenaline high? Are they a loner or a lone wolf? Have they had current or past legal problems? Now, this one actually comes from a study that I read, and it talks about certain drugs affect 11% of the population in a negative way. This is not to say that all these drugs are bad, because they aren't. Some people's systems, it changes them. And that's why it's important to make sure that your psychiatrist or psychologist that prescribes these drugs, make sure that you visit them. But people that are on antidepressants such as Prozac or Paxil or Luvox or Effexor or Prestige or Zoloft, 11% of those people will become violent. So we need to ensure that if they started taking it, that they are following up with their psychiatrist or psychologist. For the most part, these drugs do what they're supposed to do. Do they take halcyon or ADHD medications? Again, 11%. Have they received multiple disciplinary actions at work or school? If they're a student, have they been permanently removed from a class, suspended, or expelled from school? Have they been suspended or removed from multiple classes? If they're working, have they undergone a job change that was involuntary? Because if so, that raises the possibility. Have they had spouse or girlfriend boyfriend problems? Are they a victim of bullying or teasing? Do they appear to be under extreme stress? Do they have a conflict or a hostile environment at home? Have other people around them joked and said they'll become the next active shooter? Is there a suspected history of child abuse? This is different from actually knowing they're an abused child or were an abused child because you suspect it but you can't prove it. Do they lack social skills? Do they not take criticism well? Do they blame others for their problems? Do they regularly have conflicts with others? Have they either perpetrated or become a victim of domestic abuse? And finally, do they have financial difficulty? Now, individually, none of these are serious. However, when you start adding them up and they have multiples of these, we see that they typically become uh, either a mass shooter or a mass bomber. That doesn't mean one or two. I'm talking 8 or 10 or more. So don't evaluate them on a one by one, evaluate it as a whole. So, once again, correlation does not mean causation, meaning that just because they have one or two of these, they're going to become a mass shooter. However, if there are 6 or more of these, I would start watching them. And if there's 10 or more, then I would start bringing law enforcement in. Now, the exception to that rule is the high value. When I talk about the high value signs, I'm talking threats of homicide or suicide, social media threats or extremely dark psyche, pet or animal torture. They've discussed becoming an active shooter, abnormal interest in guns or in bombs or bomb making, fantasies about homicide or suicide, and pet or animal abuse, and finally, impulse purchasing weapons. All of these are high value factors. If you see 3 or more of those, I would begin to start contacting law enforcement. Now, you need to contact law enforcement. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. A lot of people are saying after the fact, well, I thought he was acting weird, but we didn't do anything. We didn't tell anyone. Well, guess what? 10 people are dead because of that, or 3 people are. So when you see something, you have to say something. What does that mean? Well, typically what will happen is law enforcement will investigate it. If they find it credible, then they'll get a court order to take them to a mental institution for a 72-hour evaluation. And in 72 hours for a mental evaluation, if these are the case, if they could become a mass shooter or a mass bomber, they will know and they will begin to treat them. Now, in future videos, I'm going to discuss some of the more prevalent triggers that cause them to snap and become an active shooter or an active bomber. So please stay tuned. And, you know, this is important stuff. Share this with others because the more they know these signs, the more we can stop these before they happen. Until next time, please be careful and keep situationally aware. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment. Until next time, see ya.